Welcome, everybody. Welcome. We're very happy to have you here with us for our May session of the Young Adult Ministry Leadership Series. As you know, my name is Castillo. I am Secretariat Director for Mission at the Department of Pastoral Ministries in the Archdiocese of San Antonio. And I'm very, very happy to act as your host this evening. And we have a treat for you tonight because we're going to be having a wonderful presentation on behalf of Jonathan Lewis from the Archdiocese of Washington. I sent his bio along with the invitation that we sent for this evening. So you already know that he works there at the Archdiocese of Washington, taking care of the young adult ministry with parishes and different movements. And you also know that he had an important role to play on behalf of the young adults of the world during the Synod that took place before the publication of Christus, Vivit, out of which the document came from. So he has been invited to speak on the topic of implementing Christus, Vivit tonight. And but we agreed that he will focus not only on the document and not only on what it means to implement Christus, Vivit under the current circumstances, which are challenging and interesting, but also he would share with us a little bit of his experience in the Synod and what came after. So Jonathan, again, we're very happy to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Aaron, thanks so much again for the invitation. And it really is a pleasure to be with all of you. I trust that people are there behind the names or the not sharing your screen. All of you sharing your screens are the brave people who aren't multitasking or finishing eating dinner or something. It really is a pleasure to be with you all. As Aaron said, my name is Jonathan Lewis. I've worked for the Archdiocese of Washington for 7 years and serve as the Assistant Secretary for Pastoral Ministry and Social Concerns. So I oversee our Office of Youth Ministry, CYO, Young Adult Ministry, Campus Ministry, and Family Life Ministries, which I mentioned because I think that's relevant in terms of the scope of ministry with and alongside young people, as we'll talk. If I can be successful here, I'm going to try to share my screen with some slides that I put together that hopefully everyone can see and we can have a good conversation. So as Aaron had prepped me, I'm going to maybe present for 20, 30 minutes or so, and then we can have a good conversation. And I certainly look forward to hearing from you and the wisdom of your communal reflection over these past months on the document, Christus, Vivit. I'm going to focus more generally on themes rather than hone in deeply on the document itself, because it sounds like you studied that quite well, which I commend you for, because I think, unfortunately, too many leaders totally glossed over or missed this document. So maybe to start with saying that, unfortunately, especially in a place like Washington, D.C., but I know that no place is exempt from the suffering of the heart, of sort of the reemergence of the sexual abuse of young people and the cover-up of bishops in this country, or the actions inappropriate of bishops. Certainly the former Archbishop of Washington was one of those people that made headlines in the same days as the Synod, right? And so that was certainly a theme that ran through, especially of young people from Germany and the United States and Australia and Chile and other places. But I think the long-term suffering that I would say certainly is the work of the devil is that so much of the church's attention was pulled away from this Synod on young people and pulled away from Christus, Vivit, that many haven't read the document, right? I mean, many of our priests hopefully have read Deus Caritas Est of Pope Benedict, or Evangelii Gaudium by Pope Francis, but Christus, Vivit, it's my sense that many of our clergy even haven't really spent time with the document. And so I'm so grateful you have, and maybe as you move forward in your ministry, it's something to sort of go back to, because I do think it's a treasure, especially for our ministry with young people. I shared here one of the photos of the Synod, and I'll share some of the different photos throughout. I was selected by Pope Francis as an auditor. So in Synods, they made a room at the Vatican, at the Paul VI Hall, just for Synods. It's called the Synod Hall, and it has about 300 seats. And so I'll share one of the pictures from that later on. But there are two groups of people. There's the bishops and then everyone else. And so it is a synod of bishops, but Pope Francis's wisdom and methodology is to invite more people into the conversation. And so this synod in particular had more young people and more lay people than any synod in history. since Paul VI reinstituted this synod process in the 1960s. And so they put us in the very back. So this is a picture before one of the sessions started, and it was every single day for nearly for 30 days in this big synod hall, and then other times in breakout rooms. And we were all sort of gathering and chatting among ourselves. And all of a sudden we see Pope Francis walking up the stairs, because we're in like the worst seats in the house, right? They put all the young kids in the back. So we're all the way like a little peanut gallery. And we see the Holy Father walking up. And so you look down, because the seats are like the cardinals, then the archbishops, then the bishops, then the auxiliary bishops, and then all of us, or priests. So we're looking like, oh, I bet there's a really important cardinal who the Pope's going to go talk to beforehand. Like, who's he talking to? That's interesting. But we kind of got scared because he just kept walking up the stairs. And the man has a bad leg. And so it was quite a bit of a walk. And so we all just sort of froze, because, what do you do when the Pope is walking towards you? You sort of find a wall. And he just came up to say hello to us. So all of us sort of gathered, and we said, Pope Francis, you should come sit with us. And he said, I wish I could. And his message to us was to keep making noise, because in the synod, when a bishop would give a little talk, instead of just politely clapping like all the bishops do, some of us in the group, especially I'll say the South Americans who were in attendance, were a little bit even louder and more joyful and boisterous. And so all the bishops would look back and say, what is going on? This is new. But they really appreciated, and Pope Francis had this little smirk on his face whenever that happened, to see lived out the joy of the gospel and how Christ is alive in all of us, right? But that's a gift that Pope Francis gave to that synod process by inviting in young people into the leadership and into the conversation. So I'll share some of my photos that I took from the time there, and would be happy to answer any questions if that's of interest as well. But in this theme of implementing Christus Vivit in times of COVID-19, I'll talk about 10 key themes, but start with my synod address. So the structure of the synod is really old school, basically, which is not surprising because it's the Vatican. But every person gives one 4-minute talk called an intervention. And so it's an interesting thought exercise, even for this group, that if you had one 4-minute talk to give to the Pope, what would you say? And you can see in the bottom corner, they put the time up on the screen. It's like a shot clock. It counts down. Then they like clap you off and cut the mic after 4 minutes, as some bishops and cardinals kind of went on and on. So everyone gives one 4-minute talk, and mine was on spiritual accompaniment, spiritual mentorship. And so I pulled out here a couple of the quotes from that presentation. I asked at the very beginning to the Holy Father and bishops, how many young people do you know by name? And emphasized that people leave the church for different reasons, but in my experience, the lack of a close-by spiritual mentor is the solution in every situation. If a person doesn't know the faith or has an issue with faith and science, like people like Bishop Barron talk about so well, you need someone close to explain and answer their questions. Now, if someone leaves the church because they see the evil or brokenness in the church, it's the positive witness of a joyful Christian who they know, who's going to be a bridge of trust and healing. If someone just feels like they're drifting from the church, they feel anonymous, lonely, it's the presence of a friend or someone to help call them by name that's nearby that's going to welcome them back in. So I think that human touch is always so necessary, no matter how much great formation or resources we have behind a video. And I think this time of COVID-19 is encouraging us to think creatively about not just putting things online, but engaging in relationship and how we can do that in so many diverse ways. This is my seat from the Synod Hall. You can see the Pope down at the front, obviously, with some of the bishops and cardinals who are organizing the Synod next to him. And you can see with the color of the hats, the cardinals are down front, and then in the red hats, and then the magenta behind them. And I took a picture here of Bishop Frank Caggiano from the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut, when he gave his intervention put up on the big screen. So my 10 key themes that relate to this time of COVID-19. The first is that all of us, young people and old, are made for more, made for greatness. It's the first line that Pope Francis knocks out of the park, right? Christ is alive and he wants you to be alive. Both of those things are fully true. This is a picture of the canonization of Oscar Romero and Paul VI that took place during the Synod that we were all privileged to be at, which was a real blessing to see the holiness of each person, that each of us has called us to that. So I think this theme of being made for more, it focuses on the theme of hope in a world that's desperate for it. I think we see today in this time of COVID-19, so much internal and external physical suffering. That call to greatness, to holiness, is especially needed today. Second, the gift of youthfulness, that youth is itself a gift. I love in Christus 14, for God, for Christ, age did not establish privileges, and being young did not imply lesser worth or dignity. I mean, he spends so much of the time lifting up the stories in Scripture and the lives of the saints, of young people who were who made heroic witness, and who listened to the life of the church. This is a picture of us at the closing of the Synod. I'm down in the front saying something stupid, probably. But I love this idea that Christ has sanctified youthfulness. And in fact, as Pope Francis talks about, God did not become incarnate or give us a model of himself as an elderly person. There's no middle-aged Christ. He only gave us an image of himself as young, as full, as born into vulnerability in the context of a family, who died in the height of his young adulthood. And so that's a theme that gives me some hope as I'm living out the end of my 33rd year, hopefully not going to die on a cross in July on my birthday, but that theme of a call to greatness, right, that we're made for more. And I think in this time of COVID-19, although it's very silly, it's a little insight that maybe companies or organizations, like I see some young people here doing some IT, that companies and churches are learning more about the gifts of young people, as pastors have probably turned to their youth minister or the younger staffer and said, hey, how do we put this mass online? How do we do this recording? That's just a silly example of young people knowing technology, but it's an insight into the giftedness that's a part of all of our youthfulness. The third theme is that the church needs us as young people. This is an image I took at the final mass. So they asked all of the synod members, the bishops and the young people, to process in down the center of St. Peter's Basilica. It's almost always roped off. You can't walk down the middle. But for the procession, of course, they opened it up for all the bishops and for the Pope. And we led the procession, which was a really beautiful experience. But it's true, as Pope Francis says, that the church needs us. In that first paragraph, that young people can keep her young. They can stop her from becoming corrupt and can keep her moving forward, right? The great line of Junipero Serra that I see on your website, right? Siempre adelante. When Serra was canonized in Washington, D.C. by Pope Francis a few years ago, that was the theme of Pope Francis' homily, right? Keep moving forward. And we need the church to help us move forward. In fact, the final paragraph of Christus Vivit is all about young people, like the beloved disciple in Peter. John, the beloved, reached the tomb at the resurrection first, but he waited for Peter. There's this tension, there's this great dance and dual giftedness between the young and the old, but the church needs the young church, the young voice. And this calls for an increased presence of young people in key leadership decisions. Can you see the last line in that, or is it cut off by my screen? The key leadership decision-making.
Yeah, it's a little cut off.
A little cut off. The full screen, I don't know why is, I don't know if I can hide that a bit, but so the church needs, I just got muted. No, there we go. The church needs young people, not just at the leadership table as one seat, but in those key leadership decisions. Where decisions are being made, young people need to be present because they bring a gift of youthfulness. Fourth, and this is something I'd like to dwell on relative to COVID-19, Francis talked beautifully about the gift and the importance of friendship. How it's one of life's greatest gifts, that Jesus calls us a friend. Christianity is a team sport. And there's a wonderful article, maybe 3 years ago now, in the Atlantic magazine called The Church of CrossFit. But in it, the author talks about why many young people are leaving traditional churches or institutions of faith and affiliating or connecting more into community at small gyms or fitness centers like CrossFit or yoga or Pilates or bar studios, things like that. And what they're finding there is friendship, is community. And so that's always been sort of a good examination of conscience or assessment for me, is thinking about some small community-based organization that's not a church. So when you go to a CrossFit gym, I'm not that fit, but when you go to something like that, some of the key markers that I think our church could learn more from. One is when you go, it's a small group of people. It's not hundreds or thousands of people gathered. I think megachurches really create some tension or difficulty in forming this friendship unless it's very well organized into smaller communities. The second thing is you get a coach. So when you go there, it's a small group and there's a coach. And the coach's job is to help you. In fact, you probably do an inventory where they meet one-on-one with you and say, hey, what are your personal goals? And how can I help you reach there? And then they hold you accountable. So if you don't show up for 2 or 3 weeks, you're getting a phone call. Or when you show up the next time, your butt's probably getting called out to say, hey, Jonathan, where you been? We've missed you. Do you want to still reach these goals? Is that important to you? Come on, you got to get your butt here. You matter to this community. We've missed you, right? That's a sense I think very few young people have in our churches. In most cases, people don't know if others are there. People aren't missed. And so eventually, I think with that lack of friendship or community, it's easy just to drift away. Again, studies continue to show us that young people don't leave the church with a big jump. Young people slowly drift away, like something floating back into the ocean. And so the question as the tide rolls back is, who are those safety boats or those life jackets to go back in and help that person stay afloat and to walk back into the shore? There's some wonderful studies being done by St. Mary's Press and recently by Springtide Research and Fuller Theological Seminary that talks about a number of these themes of friendship, and they use different language for them. One phrase they use is relational authority, which is a really important theme to me. And the principle is that for most contemporary people, not just young people, but most people born or living in the 2000s, institutions don't hold weight anymore. And I think this probably affects different cultural families a little bit differently, but the principle I think is fairly true that, when I was growing up, my dad would go to the bank on Saturdays before noon, because that's how you cashed your check. Today, more and more people can just snap a picture on their phone. Or if you are, like I just did, my friend went to the store during COVID and bought our family some things. He lives across the street, and I just Venmo'd him some money, right? We've moved from having to go to an institution, like to go to a bank to drop off our check, and found relational ways of doing business, going to farmers markets instead of just going to stores, going to small gyms instead of just big box gyms. But in so many ways of even commerce, we found relational ways of doing it. And I think the same thing needs to be true of church, that we've kind of forgotten this core sense of being community or being a spiritual family. And there's a lovely book called Sticky Faith, where the author talks about this important 5-to-1 ratio in terms of friendship and mentorship, that young people who stay connected to the faith long-term can identify 5 adults of significance in their life who encourage them in their life of faith. And so that could be a parent, a godparent, an aunt or uncle, a grandma, a coach, a youth minister, a priest, high school leader, lots of different people. But the studies show that if a young person can get to 5, then they're more likely to practice their faith long-term. Unfortunately, in the Catholic Church, our tradition, and I think in most youth programs, has been the opposite, right? If you have a retreat or a lock-in, you say with young people, you say, oh, I need 1 adult for every 5 kids. And so now they're saying we have to invert or flip the whole math, that every one person needs 5 key adults in their life to be those spiritual mentors or guides. And so I think it's an interesting question of how are we always cultivating not just a model of church or model of leadership where we have one person who does everything. That's not sustainable. That person can't be a mentor to 100 people. We have to form and lift up all of these different persons of reference in life, whether it's a godparent, a confirmation sponsor, a youth minister, an altar server coordinator, a CYO coach. All of these people need to see their mission of evangelization and discipleship in the life of young people. Because what studies continue to show us is when there is that friendship, that belonging, that's the pathway that most quickly and effectively leads people to lifelong practice of faith. That belonging leads to behaving, leads to believing. This is the RCIA process, right? There's a period of inquiry in the context of small faith community. People begin to take on and do the practices of faith to learn how the dance of Christianity lives. And then they're fully initiated into the sacraments. They come to a full awareness of the Christian life to experience the sacraments at Easter and to reflect that mystagogia. And so I think that the same methodology is true with the life of faith. Sherry Waddell in Forming Intentional Disciples, another great book, talks about this bridge of trust, that we start with that bridge of trust. And in those one-on-one conversations, walk with a person their journey of faith. I think too often people simply don't have friends. And studies continue to show in terms of talking with millennials or young people that they don't have a lot of friends who are Catholic or friends at all. This has especially been true in times of COVID. There are some really challenging stats that today almost a third of millennials say that they always or often feel lonely. And so we are one of the, if not the loneliest generations in US history. And I think this is something that maybe older folks don't realize or don't think of as much, right? Because when you're married or you are rooted in community where if your kids go to a particular school, then you don't feel lonely because you know a lot of people. Or if you're the really engaged, really active Catholic, kind of the nerd Catholic like I am, you're probably really involved in your church and you probably know a lot of people. But that's like only about 5 or 10% of our Catholics. Most people, the 90% plus, outside of maybe their family, don't know as many people. This is especially true of young people. Added to that reality, not even in terms of feeling alone, young people especially are physically alone. So almost a third of all Americans live alone. This is more than any time in US history. There's a great article in The Atlantic just a couple months ago called The Domestic Church, something like, not the domestic church, excuse me, The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake by David Brooks. And it's very long, it's like 25 pages, very typical for The Atlantic, but it's really well done. And it basically talks about, quite honestly, what the Anglo Church has an experiment that's been failing for decades, which is this idea of a mom and dad and kids by themselves is a failure, that we can't support ourselves, sometimes economically, but certainly not emotionally and spiritually. We rely upon this network or web of relationships and this sense of freedom to only have a small group of people of a nuclear family isn't really true freedom. And so I think in the African-American community, in the African community, in the Hispanic Latino community, we see the richness of extended family being woven into life. Now there's certain sacrifices that come, limitations on that freedom, but also a great sense of belonging and community. So there are a number of quotes as well, or statistics that came from a new research study on COVID-19 from Springtide Research on a study called Belonging, where they identify of all these young people who live alone, about a third, most feel very isolated, and half said they feel scared and don't want to be alone. And these are young people, like ages, I believe the study was like around teens and 20s. And so you're talking about people who are very well connected on their phone. They're probably on Instagram and have hundreds of followers, but they still feel the sense of isolation or loneliness. And I think this is why Francis spends so much time on this theme of friendship. That same study asked young people who have reached out to you and did it help? And of 100 young adults, they interviewed thousands, but out of 100, only 1% of young adults have been reached out to by their pastor. So that's the bottom of that quote. I'm sorry you can't see it. That only 1% of young people have been reached out to from someone from the church. And so this is, I mean, certainly we should be reaching out to the elderly and people who are living alone. But I think when we think of living alone, I at least think of elderly people, someone in their 60s or 70s or 80s. But do we remember that young people, in some cases, also live alone or also feeling alone and isolated? And so I think our pastoral care in times of social distancing has to have a preferential option for those who are lonely. And as Francis talks about this throwaway culture, those who are most lonely or most thrown out are the young and the old. The fifth theme of Christus Vivit is to be a saint, is to be yourself. This is an image of our small group team. Not so small groups, but that's what they were called. And you see maybe if you know Cardinal Donardo there in the center. In the back left, you see Bishop Barron, Cardinal Tagle next in the middle to Cardinal Donardo. I'm kind of back right with my head poking through. But folks from over 20 countries were in our little small discussion group, which was a great gift and really highlighted the beautiful diversity of the church. And there's not just one way to be Catholic. There's not one way to be a saint. But it requires, to be a holy person, requires that spiritual guidance. And it requires time to grow in that journey of faith. And so I think that one of the takeaways in this time of social distancing is that quiet time to be with ourselves and to really grow in a sense of self-awareness and to cultivate, not to fill every space with young people with programming and noise and music, but to how do we create a space of silence and to cultivate a sense of self-awareness. So we've used like Living Your Strengths or Strengths Finder as a tool that helps identify gifts, even things like the Myers-Briggs test. I think those little things can be helpful. I found them helpful in marriage with my wife, but also I think just to gain a sense of confidence. I was on a video call today with some new priests who newly ordained last year, and one of the questions we asked was, what's the time in this last year when you've seen your gifts at work in your pastoral ministry? And there's this one Hispanic Latino priest who like paused for like 20 seconds, which is a long time on a video call. And it took him a while to really think, how are my gifts being used? And it struck me that this was not a question he's asked himself very often. And maybe a question all of us need to ask ourselves. How do we see God working in us and through us, and how he calls us to use our gifts to be a saint? The sixth theme that I took away from Christus Vivit is the importance of these three great truths that Francis talks about in section 112 and on. The kerygma, that basic proclamation of faith, that has to be, preaching Christ crucified in the resurrection has to be part of everything we do. Maybe not at the beginning, we don't have to lead with that, but certainly as a part of our journey of faith, we have to encourage people to come in to encounter Jesus Christ. This picture here is of the little chapel right next to that big synod hall. And so every day, as you walk in, myself and other bishops would just sit down for a moment, say a prayer, someone would be praying the morning office. And I just loved this little space, not so glamorous for being in the Vatican, just a simple little chapel, but seated next to one another, young people, cardinals, the Pope as he would pop in to pray, a little privileged space to remember and to focus on our encounter with Jesus Christ. And certainly I think this time of COVID reminds us today of how much our world and we ourselves need saving. And so that theme of needing a savior, I think is becoming more, people are becoming more aware of that need, that we cannot save ourselves. We do rely on other people, and life is vulnerable. We are vulnerable. And there's some good news in that, in the gift of eternal life, that death is not the end, but a beginning. And I think that highlights an opportunity to preach the gospel. This is my wife, who was in Rome with me for that month, and Pope Francis blessing our unborn baby at that time. And one of the days before the Synod ended. And my seventh theme is to expand this word vocation. And this was a theme that I really loved from the Synod, is because I think how poor we do it in America, quite honestly. Whenever I go to Mass and they pray for vocations, they don't pray for me, and they don't pray for my marriage. They don't pray for you if you're single. They only pray for people who are becoming priests or religious. And there's a beautiful need to pray very specifically for priests, for vocations to priesthood and religious life. That should absolutely be prayed for. But we also need to pray for married people. We need to pray for people who are living a single vocation, even if it's temporary. And so Francis continues to go back to our baptismal call to holiness. That is our primary vocation, the universal call to holiness that Vatican II spoke of so beautifully. And there was a Benedictine abbot from England in my group, and he talked about this three senses of a vocation that really resonated with me, that our primary vocation is our baptismal call to holiness. And what builds on that is our specific sacramental vocation, like a call to marriage or to priesthood. And then what builds on that even higher is a personal sense of apostolate or missionary discipleship, a particular Christian mission. But all of those flow together. And so if your volunteer work, your apostolate, is taking away from your marriage, you're doing it wrong. If a certain mission isn't helping you to be a good and holy priest or woman religious, it's not that's not the right thing for you. It's a good discernment tool. But the foundation of all of that is our baptism that is common to each of us. Pope Francis has no special extra baptism, no special extra call to holiness than we do. And I think people are hungry for a calling to do something, especially as we're cooped up in these days. But even afterwards, I think there's a sense of mission that people are hungry to be called to, but we have to call people to it. This is a little Easter pictures of Esther, my daughter Esther Francis, named in part after the Holy Father, and St. Francis of Assisi, who is now 15 months old. So from the Synod of 2018, you can see how far she's come as sort of as a time marker, and my wife Gina. So the eighth theme is to prioritize young leaders. That the church, again, needs young people, and we have to empower young people in decision-making spaces. The reality of the church, it's not a bad thing to say, but the reality is that our church leadership is a gerontocracy, meaning it's an organization made up of elderly people or older people. That's just the reality of the Catholic Church. Pope Francis is an old man. He's an elderly man. The leadership of the church will always be old. The question is how empowering young people and mentoring young people alongside the gifts of the elderly or the gifts of the elders in our church can bear great missional fruitness and great mentorship. Francis talks persistently about the need for the young and the old to form a great intergenerational alliance. And I think that there's a great opportunity for that. But unfortunately, too often, young people don't see pathways of leadership or pathways of discipleship. So I commend Aaron and the Archdiocese for the work they're doing in lifting up leaders and creating space for formation that's desperately needed. And then tying in point 9, that relationship between young and old is essential because our elders have wisdom. So I think one question for your ministry with young adults is, how are you building in spiritual mentorship into whatever you're doing? How are we helping parents and families of young adults, for young people who still live at home with their families? How are we inviting young adults into young adult ministry, how are we inviting adults into young adult ministry? So one idea I've had is, for so long, we've spent time trying to recruit young adults to lead young adult ministry. But in a place like Washington, for example, there are young adults who are in DC maybe for 1 year, or maybe for 6 months, maybe for 2 years, and then they move. And so what often happens, maybe it happens in your church, is a group comes together, they start, and then they leave. But I think maybe there's an opportunity to work with elders in our church, people who are middle-aged or older, to be a part of young adult ministry teams, not to be the one up making an announcement, but to be that tia, that tio, that mentor, that role model and spiritual friend to a team of young adults. I know that I'm in a stage of life where I would love to be mentored by an older dad, an older person who's in a senior leadership role in the church or in a company. We're all in need of mentorship. But I think too often older people think, oh, I'm not young, I have nothing to offer. When in fact, I think there's a great treasure and wisdom we just have to find ways to connect them more and more. And then finally, my 10th theme is to make it local. Pope Francis and the Synod were very clear of not giving a lot of specifics, if you notice that in the document. And the reason is things are very different with my friends in Pakistan or Iran as they are in the United States. And so it wasn't possible to make broad, sweeping action items from the Synod, much as young people especially wanted something very specific or concrete. But the Holy Father does ask that communities examine respectfully and seriously the situation of young people in ministry with them. So I think it's important to start with your particular parish reality. I am no expert in the Archdiocese of San Antonio or in your parish, but you are, and other people alongside you. And so how do we really enter into a process of discernment to help make the work we do local? One idea I've had, this is a video call actually from 2 hours ago. We had a video call with Archbishop Gregory here in Washington and young adults and campus ministry leaders who are graduating from college. But it's a good little experience of what's called synodality or walking together in this journey of faith. And so one idea I've had at a very practical level is to host a local synod. There's no reason for over the course of a half day or a day that you couldn't invite people together, reflect on a document, share some personal prayer time, share meals and coffee breaks like we did at the Synod, have some short talks on people's experience, including discussion, and then follow up in a kind of a smaller group to make some recommendations to the parish. Some people call them listening sessions, but when it's done in the spirit of prayer, I think that spirit of listening that Francis talks so much about too is of great fruit and can give us a lot to chew on. So practical in terms of next steps. The first for young people, my recommendations to young adults is to give 100% to grow in holiness. Don't leave 5% in a closet as though you can keep it away from God. To hang out with older folks, find a mentor, but also to be a mentor. And spend time living out your baptismal call to holiness. I know that I stressed out in my teenage years, wondering what my vocation was going to be. But I think if I would have spent a little more time actually living my baptismal vocation, trying to be holy where I was, I would have gotten to my sacramental vocation maybe quicker, but also I would have been better for it. Because those virtues that we pick up along the way form us for whatever stage in life God calls us to. We have to overcome polarization and divisions, especially in an election year. Things get nasty, not only in a place like DC, but in families and in communities across the world. We need to find a way to cross a border, not necessarily a physical border, but to think of crossing a border of our hearts. A friend who who's a missionary says that to be a missionary is to be someone who crosses a border. Maybe it's the border in your heart because you're an introvert to go introduce yourself to someone you don't know. Cross that border and take the initiative. Maybe it's the border to contact your priest and ask to start something new. Maybe it's the border to cross to find a mentor, to ask someone to mentor you once a month and have coffee. But we have to take those risks. We have to say yes to leadership and then commit to it, and to be reliable. A priest friend once said that one thing he recommends from young people is to buy a plant, so that if nothing else, there's something in your life that relies upon you, that it will die if you don't take care of it. And I think sometimes young adults And at the young adult stage of life can sort of be so flexible. You're like, oh, I can go to church wherever I want. I'll travel wherever I want. It's all about me. I'm very flexible. I can move apartments. It doesn't matter. But even to have a plant where something relies upon you to take care of it. For those who are old enough, you might remember the little Tamagotchi toys that you had to like feed your little online animal. There's something about having some responsibility, because if you had to go out of town, you had someone had to take care of that little toy to keep it alive. And for us, what can we do now? Some next steps. I think from all of this, especially in this time of social distancing and what we might jump back into, I think we have to focus on relationships, to make it personal, not programmatic, to prioritize listening to young people and putting young people in leadership positions, especially decision-making leadership, to find ways of cultivating that intergenerational relationship and mentorship, to focus on all of our all vocations and sense of vocation, including recognizing that married people are young adults too. It's not necessarily just a singles club for everyone. There are a lot of young married couples. Most people who get married are young. Most people in RCIA are young. And there's a great opportunity to think creatively about where we find your young people. 7, to prioritize parish-wide renewal and evangelization. I know in DC, so many people want to start a young adult group, but it just becomes like a parallel parish. As one priest said to me here, Jonathan, if I were a young adult, I wouldn't want to come to church here. And I said, ooh, Father, that's kind of rough, right? He didn't think his church was very alive. And so the goal there isn't to start a young adult group, but to help the church be alive, to invite young people into the leadership and into the life of the whole community. Because young people are just like everyone else. We just want to be a part of something that's alive. As Francis named the whole document, right? Christ is alive. I think we have to be smarter to identify the needs of our specific young people, to take the time to ask the question, what are the ages of young people at our parish? What stages of life are they in? What's their cultural experience? What's their language experience? It's different maybe at our parish than one next door. And so one program might not work everywhere. And that's why listening, entering into this process of discernment together, listening to the voices of our young people and lifting up leadership is so important. To think through how you can reach beyond the parish, to maybe partner with neighboring parishes. We've had great success in regional ministry because in most parishes don't have enough active young adults to form a young adult community, but 2 or 3 parishes together can have a group that can be quite healthy. Because if it's too many awkward people, they're not so healthy people, it can really take the whole group down. To see how we can find and form older adults to serve as mentors to young people. And then finally, and my grouping of 12, like the apostles, to accompany a few people. Each of us are called to have a few people in our lives that we walk to. Jesus had Peter, James, and John. He had his group of 3. He had the 12 apostles, and then he called the 72. And so I think for our own lives, who are the 3 people who we're called into specific and intentional relationship with? Who are the 12 people that are in our small community, maybe a group like this, that we share life with? And then the 72, I kind of think in the age of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, the 72 is sort of that bigger group that we share to the world. How are we present on a digital sphere to those we encounter? Are we putting together are we being the face of Christ to other people? So now I'd love to maybe take some questions and continue a conversation. I apologize for going a bit over the time, but looking forward to talking more together.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Remember that you can raise your virtual hand and we'll be happy to unmute you so you can participate freely and ask your questions, or you can use the chat also to ask your questions to our guest tonight. So while someone posts a question, I want to ask you more on a personal level. Which one is your greatest memory from that experience of being at the Synod with your wife, expecting your child? I mean, it was a great combination. So if you had to pick one.
It was just such a privilege sort of at a big picture level to be taken seriously in the church. I mean, I've been very grateful to have many mentors myself, but it was just a real blessing to be in these small groups of bishops and cardinals. And I remember Cardinal Gennardo even at one point stopping the conversation because there were 2 young women who we hadn't heard from in a few minutes. And he said, I just want to pause. Nikki, do you have anything to share? And that sense of like, wow, he stopped the bishops and cardinals from talking to listen to us was really impactful. Maybe another highlight was the Archbishop in charge of the new evangelization of the Vatican, Fiescella, I don't know how to pronounce his name in Italian, but at one point he raised his hand in the Synod Hall and he said, what are we doing sitting in a room all day? He goes, we're talking about accompanying one another and being on a journey, and we're just sitting here. let's organize a pilgrimage. And so the Pope's like, okay. So he organized in like 2 weeks this pilgrimage. They bused all of us, or anyone who wanted to go, on the half day off we had, like 10, 15 miles away. And we did this old ancient pilgrimage down through the streets down from the hills outside of Rome into the city of Rome to St. Peter's. And Pope Francis had a private mass for us at St. Peter's. But it was neat to kind of have that spirit of encounter. And so here you are, like with a backpack on, walking next to Cardinal Schomborn, who wrote the Catechism of the Catholic Church, just talking, right? But it was that experience of faith that was so valuable, not just sitting and having formal conversations, but that was a really unique moment, obviously.
Thank you. Sister Christina, please go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you. And I'm always so energized when I come to this group. I think something that I want to share with all of you is that I need you. Us young adult sisters need other young adults as well. I think it's very common that we're kind of like siloed off, and we try to have our own network of young nuns in the United States, and we minister. But these conversations, these issues, like how do you find leadership and how do you build mentorship and all of that? Just because we're part of a community doesn't mean that it's like already taken care of. Like, we're still figuring it out as well. So I just want to say, like, I want more of this like dialogue and partnership with other young adults from different sacramental vocations as well.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Sister Maria Patricia.
Hello, very good presentation. One of the things that I think it's really lacking is what you said about the small groups, and not only with young adults, but the process of sometimes I get overwhelmed when we concentrate youth in these mega big events that we have. We have to ground them down to the small community so they have that sense of belonging from as youth, to be able to engage them through the times. And I think also in the families, especially the interconnection between churches. I come from a small little church here in San Antonio, and I think that's one of the rich things that I recognize in your presentation that you were saying. You know, sometimes we're such a small group, but our Franciscan priests, I think, are doing a great job where they're bringing two communities, Our Lady of Angels and St. Joseph, and doing these reaching out right now, taking food to the families, doing these different activities grounded with the Franciscans, but also think that the church, like Pope Francis says, needs to go out. We need to go into the homes, just like those young people are going to those small communities of the gyms, of the fitness centers. We have to also reach out in a certain way in their environment. You know, we don't expect them to come; we have to go to them. So I think that's one of the challenges we do have. We don't expect for them to come into our churches. Expect us to encounter them where they're at too.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I just shared in the chat the article that I had referenced on the Church of CrossFit. I think the success of churches after COVID is going to be the ability to connect people personally into small communities, whether it's, and there's so many ways to do it, right? Whether you identify people in different neighborhoods and connect people to people who live down the street from each other or in the same apartment building, or whether you connect people by affinity and have young people together and young families together. I just think it's the only way, is a place where you have friendship, because and a priest also made the comment that in most of what our church has been doing in this time, which has been good and people have been trying new things, a lot of it has been one direction. So I'm going to share and make mass available, but you can only participate really a little bit because you're on a screen. or I'm going to give a homily and we're going to put it online. That's good. But it's only one direction, where conversations like this or in-person small communities allow the opportunity for people to listen and to be listened to. And that can happen in big groups, right? And that's, I think, been the challenge of what I say is sort of the personality Catholicism in the United States and some of these big events, is we spend all our time focused on big events, and then we wonder why it burns out, like a little candle or a little match. Well, I think if we use that fire that gets stoked at big events to connect people to small communities, it has kindling for it to burn. A friend in DC went through RCIA as a Protestant, loved it, and at the very end she said, "This is amazing. What do I do now?" to her RCIA coordinator. Now that I'm fully initiated as a Catholic, what do I do? And the person looked at her and said, "You just go to church." And she was it's sort of funny, right? But it was so sad. She was so sad because she wanted to be active and engaged. And she thought, oh my gosh, I'm spending a year doing this formation weekly with a mentor. But what struck me is she had a small group called an RCIA group, and she had a mentor called a sponsor. And they walked together. And then at the end of that year, she was told, your sponsor's probably not going to follow up with you, and there is no more small group. Just go to church in this big group. And she felt anonymous and she felt alone. And she thought, this cannot be enough. There has to be more. And so I think we should learn something, right? RCIA is so important. We require people to go through it to become Catholic. And you can't become Catholic unless you have a sponsor. Well, let's make mentorship more normal. You can't go through RCIA unless you have a small community to do it with. You can't do it alone. Okay, well, let's make sure that everyone has small communities, not just young people, but people of all ages, which is why I think the lay movements in the life of the church and small group networks and communities are so essential.
Thank you, Jonathan. There's a question for you in the chat. There are a couple of questions. The first one is, what are your top three favorite types of young adult activities to coordinate?
Oh, type of activities to coordinate. I think any activity that meets the needs of young people. You know, we've done different things in different places. In the Archdiocese of Washington, people know DC as a city, but we have a city urban population, we have a suburban population around the Beltway, and we have 3 counties that are mostly farmland. And so it is pretty different in different places. You know, when we've done sports ministry, that's something that I really value, because I think that sports is probably the new pre-evangelization, to use a churchy phrase. You know, Theology on Tap started by a priest in Chicago named Father John Cusick more than 20 years ago, maybe almost 30 years ago. And the idea was to go where young adults were, right? That going out sense that Sister talked about. Nowadays, we do Theology on Tap, and I enjoy it because it's cool to book speakers and to get people together. But things like that, speaker series, you know, it's kind of the churchy group of young adults showing up to a churchy type event. And so I enjoy doing that, but because I'm a churchy person, but I think in general, we have to always start with to go out to where young people are. So those are my sort of missionary events. We hosted an event called Light the City, which is basically, we keep the church open Friday or Saturday night until like 11 p.m. in a church that's downtown, like by the Riverwalk, for example, something like that. And we send out missionaries 2 by 2 with candles. And the church is full of hundreds of candles. We have beautiful music playing and priests available to talk with people or for confession. And we simply say, come in, light a candle, pray for peace, pray for a friend, or talk to a priest, right? You don't have to go to confession, but do you want to talk to someone? Or just sit in a busy evening on a Saturday night when people are probably drunk and loud and just have a beautiful encounter. There's something about that I like, of opening the doors of the church and going out, sending people out 2 by 2 and to pray with them. And if they say, no, I'm not going to go into the church, I say, okay, well, can I take this candle and light a candle for you? Is there someone you want me to pray for? Just to ask people, who can I pray for? Like, so many people are lonely or hurt, have people affected by COVID or other illnesses, and no one has ever asked them that question. And our church isn't built to do that because we run in programs. But the more we can go out one by one or even programmatically, I think just sort of taken up a notch. I enjoy those types of events.
There's another one, another question. This one is from Mariana, and it says, any advice on how to keep young adults committed to our group, our church, our community?
Yeah, commitment's the hard thing, right? Young adults sort of famously, struggle with commitment. I think part of it can be the structures in place. And so when I speak to older adults, one of the things I remind them is that young people are entering a world that is more unstable than other times in history. Of course, there are always challenges in the world, but like, I was in high school when 9/11 happened. I graduated college in 2008 when my dad lost his business because of the economic downturn. Now I'm married with one young kid when this stay-at-home order is taking place. No kid is growing up now without an expectation of school shootings, of domestic and international terrorism. Like the mode of people is like the world cannot be trusted. And so people carry that within themselves, whether they're Catholic or not. That's just a part of, I think, our generation that we hold. And so there is a sense of like, well, I can't commit because you might disappoint me, something might change. Yet alone, looking at divorce rates or people's experience of families just having some brokenness built into that. And so how do you help people be committed? I think by forming friendship. I hang out with my friends and I don't flake on them because they're my friends. And so how are we cultivating authentic friendships in everything that we're doing right now? Sometimes for a church, you can't be friends with everyone. And certainly as a peer leader, that's a challenge, is because everyone maybe wants to be your friend. But as a peer leader, you have to sort of have really healthy boundaries, a healthy personal sense of spiritual maturity, but also knowing you're a ministry leader, not everyone's best friend, right? You don't have to accept everyone's friendship on Facebook or on followers on Instagram. Like you have the right to a private life. I think that's a challenge with especially single people. But I think we have to always try to cultivate those thick relationships, the sticky relationships that Kara Powell talks about in that book, Sticky Faith. And so thinking through how are we creating those types of thick relationships, right? How do we share some common experiences like I shared on my pilgrimage that bonded me to an experience and to other people who shared that experience? So things like retreats, I think, form those types of thick bonds. Having mentors or building things like that in. One of the things I've wanted to do is to do some professional mentoring with older people who are sort of leaders in public life or in businesses, because I think others are interested in being a part and learning from them, professional networking or other things. I think that responds to people's needs. I think the question is always, are we answering questions that people are asking? And if we're answering questions people are asking, they're going to come because they want the answer. But if we're answering lots of questions that no one's asking, then eventually, people's sense of guilt or responsibility to show up is just going to slowly drift away. They'll find that meaning in other places. And I think empowering leadership, give people a job and call people to greatness. There's a book called Do Hard Things written about ministry with teenagers. But one of the theses is young people and people in general meet expectations when you set them. So set an expectation. Hey, in this small group, we expect people to come every week. We know things might come up and that's okay, but we really ask you to commit to at least coming to 7 of the 10 weeks of this group. And if you can't, that's okay. Just talk with me, right? Set an expectation, communicate what you want people to do, and they're most likely going to reach that expectation.
Can you say the name of the book again? The one that you just mentioned? Someone else is asking in the chat.
Yeah, it's called Do Hard Things. I'll see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, there it is.
Thank you. We do have time for one more question.
Here's the other book that I mentioned just as I'm pushing out random things.
Thank you. This is very useful for everyone, I'm sure.
And as maybe a last question is coming in, I'll share. We hosted a program and developed it here in Washington that was also done in Houston called Apostles on Mission with this organization called the Catholic Apostolate Center. But it is a program for young adults. We just finished running it in English and in Spanish this past spring. But it's sort of an online program kind of like this to form leaders in the church. But one of the things we do is we have people put together a personal project. And so that's something that has sort of come to me more and more, that giving people work to do, giving them a task to discern their gifts and then helping them actually use those gifts in service. Because not everyone wants to be a young adult leader or a youth leader. Just because you're young doesn't mean you have to work only with the young people. But to help people discern their gifts and then actually give them real leadership work, I think can be really important.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. It's been wonderful having you with us this evening. Thank you all for joining. Michael, you have a question.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. something you said, Jonathan, that kind of struck to the heart of me is when the priest told you that he wouldn't come to your parish. That's kind of tough to hear. So what do you think his response would be to what would make the church more alive, or what would bring someone, maybe a fallen away Catholic or someone who's not Catholic, to come into the doors and say, wow, this place is alive? Because initially, I think all of us would think, yeah, better music, right? Like upbeat music. That's kind of superficial, but I don't know, maybe on a deeper level, like, what do you think could be some things we could do to create a more alive parish?
Yeah, there are a couple of good books written about church renewal, one called Rebuilt and one called Divine Renovation. I prefer Divine Renovation of those two, but they talk about similar things. You hit on some of them. So they talk about like the 3 H's: hymns, homily, and hospitality. Now, unless you're in a really weird situation, you probably don't have a lot of authority over your priest homilies. That's probably a sensitive subject. But I think, and probably not the music either, that's a whole different kingdom that someone runs. But I think hospitality is maybe the place to start. That's the easiest place. And so, I mean, quite honestly, I'm worried as we enter reopening public masses and there's guidelines of things, I'm a little bit worried about the hospitality factor. Studies have been showing that like 50% of people are interested in spirituality more so now. And I'm kind of wondering, what are they going to find when they get there? Pope Francis came to DC, and the question we ask parishes over and over again is, what if people come back to church because the Pope's there and they're excited, what are you inviting people to? They might show up. They might show up once, but they're not going to keep showing up unless they have something to go to, unless there's a community, unless there's friendship that's formed. I'm really scared people are going to show up to church because they feel this spiritual hunger and loneliness, and they're going to be told by an older usher or some angry person, like, put your mask back on, you're staying too close. And that experience alone is going to say, screw this. This isn't what I signed up for. I don't need this. I was happy online following the people I liked remotely. I can just do that, right? And so I think it calls us to a radical hospitality. And if you're not in charge of that ministry or you don't have sway there, start with yourself. My constant mantra when I do talks on this is get one person. Every week when you go to church or when you go to a gathering, find one young adult and go out of your way to introduce yourself and to get to know them by name. We can't maybe impact the whole community at once, but we might be able to meet one person and maybe get their email address and email them to say how nice it was to meet them. And then if you see them again at church, remember their name and say, hey, Michael, Michael, right? Oh, really nice to see you. We met a couple weeks ago. That means the world to people. And so I would start just with a radical hospitality that builds in our own hearts. But if I were a pastor, I'd start with my parish council and say, all right, parish council, every Sunday, you got to meet one new young person. And over the course of a month, we're going to talk about the experience. And we should have about 50 people who we got to know by name. And I want you to name them. I want you to remember their name. So that would be one of the recommendations that I would make. And then I'll share as a final thing, sorry. This is in the chat, I just dropped in the text of the talk that I gave. So if you're interested, if you have 4 minutes to talk to the Pope, this is what I said. But I encourage you to think about your answer to that question too.
Well, again, thank you very much for having you with us. And we're looking forward to having you physically here at some point in the future. So we can walk down the Riverwalk and exercise some of that radical hospitality you were just talking about. And we pray for you and your family, as well as for the families and the parishes of all those who are present here in the group. We can end the evening by just joining in the prayer of a Hail Mary, now that we're in May, and offer the rest of the evening to Our Lady. And again, thank you very much to everyone for being here. I'll be sending you soon more information on the last 2 sessions that we will be having of the series as Zoom meetings and other things that we're putting together for you. So, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and in the hour of our death. Amen.